Welcome to the Morning Book, where we explore books one morning at a time.
Yep, one morning at a time.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into Sarah Wynne Williams's Careless People.
hmm It's quite a title, isn't it?
It really is.
Mm.
And this book, it's not just, a standard tech company tell-all. It's really a first-hand account.
Absolutely. It would put you right there, kind of at the collision point of tech, global politics, human values,
Mm.
all of it.
Exactly. So Wynne Williams worked in international policy at Facebook, from 2009 to 2017?
That's right, 8 years. And she was right in the thick of their big international push.
Meeting heads of state, navigating some really tricky political stuff.
Witnessing moments that, well, they've really shaped the platform and, arguably the world.
So we're going to unpack her journey. It starts with this real idealism, right? About connecting the world.
Yeah, this belief in the potential.
Yeah.
But then there's this growing disillusionment, a sense that leadership priorities maybe weren't quite aligned with that initial vision.
And the real world consequences. That's key.
Definitely. So let's get into it. This fascinating, sometimes pretty troubling story behind the social media giant we all know.
Okay, so where does it start for her? This fascination with Facebook.
Well, she's working at the New Zealand Embassy in D.C. And she has this moment. She calls it a revelation.
A revelation about Facebook.
Yeah, that it wasn't just a social site. It was becoming this, global political force.
Okay, interesting. But she found it hard to get others to see it that way.
Exactly. She really struggled to articulate it. It seemed so obvious to her, but, people weren't quite getting it back then.
But she was persistent. She really wanted to work there.
Oh, definitely. She pushed hard, even when the first offer wasn't exactly stellar.
And that interview with Martin Levine sounds like a key moment.
It really was. Because you see the clash right away when Williams is thinking geopolitics,
And Levine.
growth, global business expansion. That's the priority.
So how did Wynne Williams bridge that gap?
Well, interestingly, she framed her political concerns in terms of risk to that growth, like potential regulations that could slow them down.
Ah, so appealing to the business imperative.
Precisely. And you see that tension throughout the book, right? This stated social mission versus the, let's be honest, corporate drive for more users, more markets. It makes you wonder, how often does that happen?
All the time, probably. And then there's a personal angle that helps her break through.
Yeah, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, her sister was there, and Facebook became absolutely vital for communication, a lifeline.
So it wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, tangible impact.
Exactly. Give her argument real weight, made her vision much more concrete for Levine and others.
And then she interviews with Debbie Frost. That sounds memorable.
Memorable is one word for it. Very direct. Apparently cut her off mid-story about the UN and GMOs.
Yeah.
Something like finding fecking seeds boring compared to the interesting work at Facebook.
Wow. Okay. So sets the tone for the kind of intense, maybe unconventional place she was joining.
Definitely. A very blunt signal that this wasn't your typical buttoned-up diplomatic environment.
Okay, let's shift to that diplomacy aspect, or maybe the lack thereof sometimes. That cocktail hour story. Zuckerberg being ignored by heads of state.
Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it, given his profile now? But back then,
He just wasn't on their radar in the same way.
or maybe just showed his lack of interest in that kind of traditional glad-handing. The focus was apparently on pull-asides,
Meaning.
like quick, targeted conversations. Very transactional, maybe? Less about building broad relationships.
Which contrasts sharply with Wynne Williams' background.
Completely. She comes from diplomacy, relationship building. Facebook, especially through Levine then, seemed focused purely on growth, market access, business first.
And that meeting with the New Zealand Prime Minister, oh boy.
Right, in terms of the IT support for his Facebook page.
Seriously.
And then he asks her to find his friend Choppy for a helicopter tour.
Choppy.
Choppy. Wynne Williams calls it a complete and utter lack of substance, just miles away from what she expected.
You can imagine her frustration, trying to talk policy and getting that.
Exactly. A real disconnect between her vision of engaging on global issues and the reality of how some leaders use the platform.
Then the meeting in Germany. That sounds tense.
Very, because you have Germany's deep historical suspicion of data collection.
Understandably so.
Right. Clashing head-on with Facebook's early culture. That whole think wrong, move fast and break things mantra plastered on the walls.
Which, for anyone unfamiliar, was this idea of rapid innovation, fix mistakes later.
Even if it meant, well, breaking things. Not exactly reassuring to Germans worried about data privacy, was it?
No kidding, a total culture clash.
And it really highlights that fundamental difference in how societies view tech, data, privacy. It's still playing out today, isn't it?
Absolutely. She also mentions this sense of immense wealth, almost, detachment. Comments from Sam Less and Debbie Frost.
Yeah, about being price insensitive or their own salaries being meaningless. It paints a picture of this bubble.
A different economic reality altogether.
And you have to wonder how that kind of detachment might, influence decisions, maybe make them seem less consequential.
It's possible. And the Little Red Book, Facebook's internal book of quotes.
Full of inspirational stuff about the mission, connecting the world.
But the reality she describes is more like a standard corporation focused on growth.
That's the contradiction she points to, this carefully crafted internal narrative about changing the world versus the relentless drive for market share. It makes you, the listener, think, right, how often do organizations present a mission that doesn't quite match the day-to-day reality?
Good question. Sheryl Sandberg's approach to the organ donation idea seems like a prime example of that tension.
It really does, because the focus seems to shift immediately to data, market opportunities.
Instead of the huge legal, cultural, ethical complexities involved globally.
Exactly. Wynne Williams understood those complexities from her background. Sandberg, in this telling, seemed to see it primarily through a business lens, user data, market expansion.
It's a real clash of perspectives. Business first versus, well, everything else.
And it raises that question again. Where's the line? When do data objectives potentially override ethical responsibility?
Then there's Javier Olivan. Javi, head of growth.
The embodiment, according to Wynne Williams, of that growth at all costs mentality.
She even compares it to de Tocqueville.
Yeah, his observations about American innovation, sometimes pushing ahead without fully considering the downsides. Javi and his team represented that relentless drive. Move fast, expand, worry later.
A pattern emerges.
Definitely. And that drive, as we'll see, sometimes led to pretty significant issues down the line.
There's also the blurring of lines. Facebook work seeming to benefit Sandberg personally. Nanny visas help with her book launch.
Wynne Williams describes it as junior staff doing office housework for Sandberg's personal projects.
Which raises questions about leadership ethics, doesn't it? Using company resources, staff time.
It suggests a potential blurring of professional boundaries, maybe a sense of entitlement. You wonder about the culture that allows that and the impact on staff morale.
Okay, let's move on to engaging with more difficult regimes. Myanmar comes up repeatedly.
Yes, and just connecting with someone like Aung San Suu Kyi was a huge challenge initially.
But she eventually met her.
Briefly, at a World Economic Forum lunch. But that was just the start of her Myanmar experiences, which is pretty intense.
Like the journey to meet the junta, that sounds terrifying.
It does. A non-taxi driver, her passport locked away, this surreal meeting in a massive empty throne room.
She compared it to an ISIS hostage video.
That's the comparison she makes, which is incredibly chilling. It shows the kind of unpredictable, high-risk situation she was put in.
With seemingly little support or security.
Apparently, it paints a picture of a regime operating by completely different rules.
And the substance of the meeting, the ministers arguing about banning Facebook.
While apparently not having basic government email addresses themselves, it's bizarre.
The sheer digital divide.
Absolutely. And the challenges of applying Silicon Valley logic in places with vastly different infrastructure and politics. They did tentatively agree to unblock Facebook, though.
But this became a pattern for her in Myanmar? Being sent into these strange, sometimes intimidating meetings?
Yes, repeatedly. It shows her persistence, but also the risks involved in trying to engage with a regime like that.
Turning back to the internal culture, Sandberg bringing her parents to meet the Japanese prime minister.
Highly unusual in diplomatic circles, to say the least.
I'll say. But the meeting was actually productive.
Surprisingly, yes. They talked policy data centers, womenomics.
Yeah.
So sometimes the unconventional approach worked, I guess.
Maybe. But Wynne Williams describes this feeling in the car afterwards. A quote about celebrity being a mask. Then there's Sandberg's Facebook post after the Asiana crash, mentioning she almost took that flight.
Oof, yeah. That feels like a major lapse in judgment, doesn't it? Focusing on her near miss right after a tragedy.
Tone deaf is putting it mildly. Lacked empathy.
It highlights that need for care in online communication, especially around sensitive events, something maybe not everyone grasps instinctively.
And the accounts of Sandberg being very demanding with staff, berating an assistant over a badge, reacting strongly to lateness.
It paints a picture of a high-pressure environment, especially for support staff. Maybe a bit unforgiving.
Suggests a tough culture, potentially quite hierarchical.
Wynne Williams certainly felt the pressure herself, particularly after having her children, feeling she had to return to work very quickly after maternity leave.
Which is a struggle many women face, especially in demanding fields, bringing her baby to work events.
It underscores the immense pressure, the lack of clear boundaries sometimes, trying to juggle it all in that environment.
And that story about the nanny locking herself out with the baby inside? That's every parent's nightmare.
Absolutely terrifying.
But then Marn Levine apparently brings it up later in a performance review.
That's what Wynne Williams recounts, which seems incredibly inappropriate.
Totally. Shows a real lack of empathy or understanding for the realities of being a working parent, using a personal crisis against someone professionally.
It's a stark example of how work-life balance, or the lack thereof, could manifest in that culture.
Then the Women's Day offsite, presenting this glossy, curated view of balancing motherhood and career.
Yeah, she suggests it omitted the reality for many, like the extensive support systems, nannies, household staff, that many executives rely on.
Making it seem easier or more attainable than it really is for most.
Potentially creating this unrealistic, maybe even alienating picture for women trying to make it work without those resources.
Okay, that trip to the Colombian jungle with Javi, that sounds rough.
Extremely. Lack of basic facilities, safety concerns, just challenging conditions for work.
And she was still nursing, right? The breast pump malfunction.
Adds another layer of difficulty and stress to an already intense situation. It highlights the kind of sacrifices sometimes expected.
Let's talk about South Korea, the cybercrime branch issue.
Right. Facebook initially refused to cooperate, claiming they had no jurisdiction there.
A common tactic for tech companies then, maybe?
Playing the jurisdiction card, yeah. But then came this really cynical suggestion.
To send someone junior over as a body to see if the Koreans would actually arrest them.
Exactly. Just send an employee into the fire to test the legal waters.
That's shocking. Shows a disturbing disregard for the employee's well-being.
And a certain arrogance, perhaps. A belief they could operate outside local laws. It raises huge questions about corporate responsibility, especially globally.
And Wynne Williams refused. She wouldn't be the body.
She refused. And she describes it as a real turning point for her, pushing back, asserting her own boundaries.
A moment of realization about the leadership and her own limits.
A pivotal moment of disillusionment, it seems.
Let's talk about Zuckerberg himself. The Java estate, the ancient Greece vibe she describes.
Yeah, a bit reclusive, maybe. She notes his self-consciousness swimming with his execs.
Leading him to buy a more modest swimsuit.
Apparently so. It's a small detail, but it offers this slightly more human, if still awkward, glimpse.
And the Settlers of Catan game, where everyone lets him win.
Oh, that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
About the hierarchy, the power dynamics.
Totally. Even in a casual game, the deference to the CEO. Maybe a bit sycophantic even. It tells you a lot about the internal culture.
And his attempt to talk to tourists who didn't recognize him, his hurt reaction.
It suggests maybe he lived in a bit of a bubble where recognition was the norm. Shows a disconnect from everyday life, perhaps.
Then the Indonesia trip, the tension over wearing the batik shirt.
Yeah, his initial refusal, a clash between personal preference and, cultural sensitivity in a diplomatic setting.
And the blusukim, that chaotic walkabout with the president-elect where she got separated.
Right? Highlights the logistical challenges, the potential for disorganization even in these high-level events, and the importance of cultural awareness.
And that comment about wanting endangered baby elephants for dinner.
Bizarre and disturbing. Suggests a real lack of sensitivity or awareness about conservation, maybe? A very jarring moment.
And his growing interest in politics, admiring Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, she notes that shift. Moving beyond just tech, developing political views, even controversial ones, hints at maybe a growing awareness of political power.
Okay, the big one, China. Obviously a huge strategic goal for Facebook.
Massive. The market potential was enormous. Von Smith proposed a really ambitious timeline.
But his suggestion about the Hong Kong umbrella revolution, that sounds deeply problematic.
Extremely. Suggesting Facebook praised the rule of law in a way that basically supported China's crackdown on protesters.
Just to gain favor for market access.
That's how Wynne Williams and Debbie Frost apparently took it. A shocking ethical compromise being proposed, prioritizing business over fundamental rights.
Then Marn Levine is replaced by Joel Kaplan.
Right. And Kaplan comes with deep U.S. political ties, specifically Republican connections, and close links to Sandberg.
Signaling a shift. More U.S.-centric, maybe more partisan approach to international policy.
That's the implication. And his style was different too. Tended to involve the U.S. State Department in things.
Almost like Facebook's own foreign
A
ministry.
bit like that, yeah. Relying on U.S. diplomatic muscle for business issues.
And Kaplan's suggestion about channeling money to key allies offshore, that sounds close to bribery.
It certainly raises massive red flags, suggesting potentially corrupt practices to gain influence, even with dictatorships, apparently. Very concerning ethically and legally.
This ties into the inconsistency on content moderation too, right? Resistant to removing harmful stuff, but quick to act when governments requested takedowns?
Exactly. Seemed reactive, often driven by political pressure or business interests, rather than consistent principle. Appeasing powerful governments became a factor.
Raising concerns about censorship, platform neutrality.
All of those things. Then there's that almost comical briefing mix-up before meeting the Mexican president because of Mark's departure time.
A moment of dark humor, but shows how easily things could go wrong.
Even at that level. And meanwhile, the external pressure is building. Warnings from media, former colleagues.
About scrutiny, potential regulation,
Yeah.
foreshadowing what was to come.
Definitely. And that meeting in Ireland with Enda Kenny about taxes.
The backroom deal to minimize their tax bill.
It shines a light on those complex, often opaque international corporate tax strategies. Very controversial stuff.
Let's switch to internet.org, the big push for global connectivity.
Ambitious, yeah. But it stalled, didn't it? Despite Zuckerberg's heavy personal investment.
Suggesting it was way more complex than maybe they initially thought.
Absolutely. Huge technical, regulatory, social hurdles. Maybe a gap between the grand vision and the on-the-ground reality.
Wynne Williams tried hard to elevate Mark's profile, like at the Summit of the Americas in Panama, getting him on a panel with Obama.
She did. But then the White House intervened, apparently, and he got bumped from the main stage.
A power play. Shows the pecking order.
Seems like it. Even Facebook's CEO wasn't immune to White House influence on stagecraft. Obama did acknowledge him positively, though.
And the story of him pushing past the president of Guatemala to get into a van?
Huh. Yeah, not exactly smooth diplomacy there. Maybe reveals a bit of impatience or lack of protocol awareness.
But the state dinner in Panama was unusual but productive. Scantily clad performers at ruins.
The czar, yes. But she notes Mark actually expressed thanks afterwards, which was apparently rare. So maybe he did appreciate the effort, despite the odd setting.
Then having to interrupt his meeting with El Salvador's president to keep him on schedule for Brazil.
Just highlights the insane schedules, the constant juggling act on these trips.
And that meeting with Dilma Rousseff in Brazil sounds tough.
Very, because Rousseff really knew her stuff about internet regulation, 0 rating.
0 rating being free access to certain services, doesn't count against data caps.
Right. And Rousseff pushed back hard. Didn't just accept internet.org, she demanded investment in actual infrastructure.
Showing not all leaders were easily swayed. Some had their own clear agendas and understanding.
Exactly. A more sophisticated response than maybe Facebook expected sometimes.
Then the move to Menlo Park for Wynne Williams. And Mark's late-night but gracious email.
A small touch, but maybe shows a different side.
But then the issue of preferential treatment for Chinese Communist Party pages.
Compared to struggles other world leaders had.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, highlighting the strategic importance placed on China. Bending the rules, maybe.
Seems like it. But the Chinese president's visit to Silicon Valley got canceled? A setback?
A definite setback.
Uh-huh.
And Zuckerberg's Facebook post about meeting Xi Jinping later seemed to embellish the interaction a bit.
Trying to spin it positively despite the challenges.
Seems plausible. He gave his big UN speech about universal internet access.
Followed immediately by lunch with Angela Merkel, who basically tells him to clean up the anti-refugee hate speech in Germany. No.
Talk about real-world pressure. Merkel holding him directly accountable for platform harms. A sign of things to come.
And the chaotic scheduling around the Global Citizen Festival, trying to get Mark on stage with Big Bird and Malala, plus wanting an audience with the Pope.
Huh. Yeah, it shows the kind of circles he was aiming for. Entertainment, activism, religion, high ambitions.
But his question about how refugees in camps would pay for the Wi-Fi Facebook was promising. That sounds naive.
Deeply naive. Revealed a fundamental lack of understanding about the reality in those camps, and maybe the lack of a real plan behind the promise.
A key moment for Wynne Williams' disillusionment.
It seems so, realizing the gap between the rhetoric and the reality of these grand initiatives.
And her realization that trying to guide Mark towards responsible engagement might actually be backfiring.
Yeah, a tough conclusion to reach. Plus the irony of pitching internet.org from a meeting room called Wicked Witch of the West.
Ouch. Symbolic, maybe? amplifying her ethical unease.
Seems likely. Then the war room for India, pushing free basics after the Brazil resistance. That sounds aggressive.
Very. Reports of misleading marketing, fake support campaigns, promising free T-shirts for protesters.
If true, those are really ethically dubious tactics, employing manipulation to drive adoption.
And Elliot Schrage trying to get India's regulator, TRAI, to accept millions of identical form submissions.
And the regulator being deeply unimpressed, frustrated by those tactics, shows a willingness to push boundaries, maybe disrespect local processes.
And India eventually blocked free basics.
They did.
Yeah.
A major blow. And then the SpaceX rocket carrying their satellite exploded.
And the Aquila internet drone crashed.
Yeah, huge setbacks for those ambitious connectivity projects. The vision hit some hard realities.
Okay, let's talk about the personal toll, the ethical conflicts for Wynne Williams herself near the end. Sandberg pressuring her to host a sleepover.
Despite Wynne Williams being uncomfortable, having had a recent health scare. Again, those blurred boundaries, the power dynamics.
Difficult to say no, probably.
You'd imagine so. And the contrast between Sandberg's extravagant gifts to her assistant versus the demanding environment Wynne Williams describes raises questions about fairness, maybe a transactional element to some relationships.
Wynne Williams getting her U.S. citizenship, her anxiety about the test, but also her growing frustration with Facebook's Street Fighter tactics.
Yeah, she wanted a more mature, open engagement with governments. Shows her personal values clashing with the company's approach.
And the board's reaction to regulation concerns, just wanting deals and offers, not engaging ethically.
I suggest that bottom-line pragmatic approach. Regulation as a hurdle to be managed, not a principle to be addressed.
The conflict over Mark's planned post about WhatsApp in Brazil potentially interfering with a police operation.
Highlights the real-world stakes. A Facebook post potentially obstructing justice. Shows the immense power and the need for caution.
Wynne Williams' own serious health issues during her second pregnancy. Working through that intense period.
Just underscores the immense personal sacrifices made in these high-pressure jobs.
And the starkly different reactions inside Facebook to Trump's election. Kaplan happy, others distressed.
Shows the internal political divisions, the diverse values within the company, even at senior levels.
The Cambridge Analytica story breaking, that was huge.
Massive. And Sandberg's initial reaction, according to Wynne Williams, was admiration for the campaign's effectiveness, even interest in hiring Trump's campaign manager.
Wow, that's surprising.
And Zuckerberg's resistance to issuing a statement, seeing criticism as biased media.
And that rosebud moment on the plane, her trying to warn Mark about the dangers of power, referencing Citizen Kane.
And the reference just completely going over his head, a poignant symbol of the communication breakdown, her growing alarm.
After that APEC trip, Mark seemed focused on his image and that new stock structure.
The one allowing him to potentially take a government role without losing Facebook control.
Yeah.
Suggests personal ambition was becoming a bigger factor.
While managing Sandberg's desire for the spotlight at Davos became more routine.
Paints a picture of leadership perhaps increasingly focused on personal branding and future plans as external pressures mounted.
Then the Facebook Feminist Fight Club emerging, revealing widespread discontent among women.
Significant internal issues bubbling up. And Wynne Williams' own experience with Kaplan's alleged inappropriate behavior.
And Elliot Scrage's dismissive response, the veiled threat she perceived.
Deeply troubling. Followed by Kaplan allegedly having her job responsibilities in retaliation.
Which led her to document concerns with a lawyer.
Yes, and then the internal talks about entering China properly. The extent of censorship and data sharing they were apparently willing to agree to. Stark contrast to their public stance elsewhere. Deeply concerning ethical compromises being seriously considered.
And efforts to downplay collaboration on censorship software, the secret launch of apps in China without approval.
Shows a pattern of prioritizing access over principles, maybe even over legality. The main concern in one memo being critical media attention, not compliance.
And the revelation about targeting teens based on psychological vulnerability.
Shocking. Exploiting vulnerability for advertising profit, and the internal pushback against even acknowledging it.
The leadership reaction to criticism, calling it a witch hunt.
Portraying themselves as victims, a defensive posture.
The story of the contractor collapsing and being ignored, a loss of basic decency.
A truly disturbing anecdote, if accurate, suggests a potentially dehumanizing work environment at its worst.
And then, tragically, Myanmar, the Rohingya crisis, Facebook's role.
Became a breeding ground for hate speech, inciting violence. The company's response initially was slow, inadequate, failure to support the right language script.
Contributing to what the UN called genocide.
An absolutely devastating consequence. And for Wynne Williams, realizing this tragedy was potentially avoidable. That seems to be the breaking point.
The profoundest stress. Seeing the gap between Sandberg's public statements on zero tolerance for harassment and the reality she experienced.
And facing potential retaliation for raising concerns herself.
Yeah.
It all came to a head.
Her final reflections. Facebook's vision corrupted. From connection to division, manipulation, especially useful for autocrats.
A powerful, sobering conclusion about the platform's trajectory and impact. And the epilogue noting Captain's continued influence at Meta underscores that some of the key figures and challenges remain relevant today.
So, Careless People really is, for you, the listener, an eye-opening, often unsettling look inside this incredibly powerful company.
Wynne Williams' experiences give us this deep understanding of the complexities, the contradictions, the consequences of Facebook's global reach.
It raises huge questions, doesn't it? About tech responsibility, ethics of growth, the personal cost.
Questions that are vital for all of us, really, about the culture that prioritized expansion, sometimes it seems, over basic well-being or societal impact.
Well, we hope this deep dive into Careless People has given you some valuable insights into the hidden realities behind the tech that shapes so much of our world.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about there.
If you found this discussion thought-provoking, please subscribe to The Morning Book.
And maybe share this deep dive with a friend who might also be interested in this critical exploration.